As disciples of Jesus Christ, we are in this process of sanctification, which means that we are growing more and more like Christ every day. We are leaving that old self behind, and we have turned away from sin, and we are moving closer to Christ and becoming more Christ-like ourselves. As Christians, as disciples, as followers of Jesus Christ, we are not supposed to remain stagnant in our faith. We are supposed to be continually changing and growing and being molded into the disciple that God has intended us to be all along. I read this book called The Cost of Discipleship, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the author, was a pastor during the World War II time. During that time, it was hard to be a Jewish person at that time. It was also very hard to be Christian. We often think that the Jews were the ones that were persecuted, but the Christians were as well. And Bonhoeffer was a dissenter because he was not willing to conform to the kind of Christian religion that was being dictated upon the faith, upon the church at that time. And he was adamant and bold and refused to do it the way other people said and chose to follow Jesus instead. And it risked his life. Every time he preached, he was in a position where it could have been life-threatening. And eventually, yes, he was arrested for the way he preached and the way and the views he took that on Jesus that were not had anything to do with what was being taught and dictated at that time. And he did die. He was a martyr in the faith for us, paving the way. But this book, Cost of Discipleship, talks about how being a disciple of Jesus Christ, it costs us something. We are not supposed to just say yes to Jesus and yes to being a disciple and yes to following God and turning away from sin and then going back to that old way of life. To be a disciple costs us something. And Bonhoeffer in this book talks about cheap grace and costly grace. And he says cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. Cheap grace means grace as a doctrine, a principle, and a system. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. Costly grace is the gospel, which must be sought again and again, and the gift which must be asked for, and the door which a person must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow it. Is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a person their life. And it is grace because it gives man the only true life. And I think this is important to reflect on costly grace and cheap grace as we begin our look at the Sermon on the Mount, because the Sermon on the Mount is costly grace. It costs us something. It costs us looking different. It costs us being indifferent. But it does pose a challenge, and it does also help strengthen our faith and strengthen our trust in God, because it takes a lot of trust and a lot of courage to really do what the Sermon on the Mount says. And we're just going to be looking at it and really how we proceed from there, how we apply that, and what we learn is up to each of us to really discern, to really spend some time with God. And I hope that this time looking at the Sermon on the Mount and this discipleship plan that Jesus has laid out for us will have an impact on us and how we continue to be shaped and molded and transformed as disciples. So know that the cost of discipleship does cost us something. The Sermon on the Mount is said to be the best known part of Jesus' teachings, but it is the least understood and it is the least obeyed, which is what makes it so costly. And Jesus is laying this plan out for his followers, and it's there for us as well. United Methodist founder John Wesley really did hang on to this and these words greatly himself, and sought them as very important. And what the Sermon on the Mount does is Jesus is taking those 10 commandments that Moses gave to the Israelites, and he's digging deeper, and he's explaining them fuller, and he's telling them what it really means to be a follower of God. Jesus is not throwing out the 10 commandments. Jesus is not replacing them with this new radical living. He's just explaining it so that it can be lived out to its fullest. Chapter 5, verse 1 through 2 is where the Sermon on the Mount begins. And listen to this intro here. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he taught them, saying, and then it goes into this speech and this discourse by Jesus that, like I said, is very well known, but not understood well, and definitely not obeyed. So Jesus is there, Jesus is sitting, and now it's up to us, and we have this opportunity to come and sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to these teachings.